those of you who haven't met her before, and I guess we say meeting these days, even though it's all virtual, so we're not shaking hands or anything, but it's as close as we're going to get to meeting anyway. Senator Kesha Ram is a first-term senator, but not new to the Vermont State House and the virtual Vermont State House and the legislature. Was previously a member of the Vermont House since 2008. So a lengthy tenure there in the Vermont House, and now moving to the Senate in the last round of elections. She serves on the Senate Economic Development Committee, Housing and General Affairs Committee. Well, that's one committee, and
It's a
then
lot.
Senate.
Yeah.
Right, a lot of words. And then the Senate Government Operations Committee. And in her, I don't know if I'd call it off hours, because I don't know that you have any off hours, but the non-legislator hours anyway. She is I'll call it DEI consultant for short, but there's a lot more to it than that. But anyway, has a lot of involvement. And I didn't realize till I read your background that you originally, a few years back, originated from Southern California and found her way to the Green Mountain State as a student at the University of Vermont, and has an impressive and long path in politics and career and service since then. So thank you so much for joining us today, Senator. It's a great honor to have you with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to sort of start with that framing, and then
That'd be
did you
great.
want to leave a lot of time for questions and everything?
Sure, I'm sure we'll have some questions.
Perfect. So yeah, you know, for those who haven't read my bio or haven't heard me say this, it feels relevant often that my father immigrated to the United States from India. My mother is Jewish American and grew up in Chicago. They met at UCLA in what became a very common love story of across cultural exchange, et cetera. But it also, I think the dark side of that is we probably would have had a lot more of those before the 60s if Asian students had been allowed to get visas to come to the United States and study. So my father was actually part of that first wave of Asian students who were allowed to study at the Ivy Leagues, the Midwestern Ivies, and the UC system in California. But lo and behold, you know, that policy change created a lot of people like me in the world. And my mother was the one who got 2 master's degrees, an MBA and a master's in anthropology. She always said her MBA taught her more about human behavior. And my father dropped out of engineering school to start an Indian restaurant, which, you know, is a really major tragedy in Indian culture, to leave your engineering program and become an entrepreneur. But he realized when he started serving tandoori chicken and roasted corn at UCLA at the big festivals that they had lines around the corner because no one had had Indian food before. So once he saw this sort of opportunity to really change the culture of Los Angeles, my parents opened New Delhi Deli in Westwood, which seems like a very obvious name now, but was very exciting at the time. And they then built up the capital that they needed to take over McGinty's Irish Pub in Santa Monica. And so I spent most of my childhood in an Irish pub that was owned by an Indian immigrant and a Jewish American woman. And in fact, the capital that they needed, you know, didn't just come from that first restaurant, but being an immigrant and a woman, it was very hard to open their first business to really get that capital infusion that they needed. And it ended up coming from the Women's Bank of Los Angeles. You know, so some of you may also appreciate that this was around the same time that another policy decision made it more possible for women to access capital and have formal banking, which wasn't necessarily available to them before. And so I just thought I really, as a kid, just enjoyed this bank full of women who gave me candy and put me up on the counter. But it was also a really safe and inviting and welcoming place for women to access capital. So my mother was the president of our food cooperative in Los Angeles for 30 years, like from when I was in diapers until very recently, definitely most of my legislative career. So we're a real cooperative family, and my mother's always been a credit union supporter. So that's what I would say about sort of early policy decisions that shape my thinking about who I am and how I, came to have success in my life, and why it's so important to turn around and give that to other people. So, I don't know that much is particularly relevant, to sort of my teenage years or my college years before becoming a legislator. But I will also say, even though my father was a fairly successful restaurateur for a while, when my mother left, they ended up getting divorced, when I was a little bit older. And my father lost the restaurant, unfortunately, kind of lived the American dream and then watched it slip away. My father never was, while my mother was very much, build your credit, Handmaid's Tale, like hold on to what you have. My father was never banked. He never had money in a bank. He had bags of cash everywhere, as many immigrants do. He had lived through the partition of India when it became Pakistan, and really never trust financial institutions for most of his life. So when I was 14, I got my first bank account, and I would cash his checks for him. So that, became really relevant when I was a new legislator, and I was on the House General Housing and Military Affairs Committee, which does a lot with labor issues and things like a pay card, where you might get your pay on a debit card in case you don't have access to a bank. And I, really obviously try to pay attention to financial regulation, but I did often fight with my colleagues who said, oh, and we should make sure that they're not preying on young people, and preying on these populations and I said, well, there's a really fine balance between preying on those populations and helping to introduce them to access to credit and access to financial instruments, because for a lot of them, they might be doing this on behalf of their families. So other banks, Chris Delia recently asked me, what can we do? And I said, just talk to young people. Don't, try to manipulate them in any way. But the more you're getting young people, particularly in the new American community, immigrant community, comfortable with banks and these institutions, the better off their whole families will be. So, I would add that as well to sort of my childhood experience that informs who I am as a legislator. So I did spend many years serving on the General Housing and Military Affairs Committee, a lot of labor issues and kind of tangential banking issues. And I see Richard and other people who were there when it was like, God, this committee could do everything and anything. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But then I moved to House Ways and Means, and I would say I felt like I stood on the shoulders of a lot of women, certainly, who had come into the legislature, and very recently, including in the last 30 to 40 years with Governor Cunin being chair of appropriations and being the first woman to serve as chair of a money committee. I mean, that's not that long ago that, we didn't have women even helping to make financial policy decisions in the state. Now we're in a very different place where women make up, all of the policy committee chairs, or the finance committee chairs, and a lot of the policy committee chairs as well. But, I do remember, even being new to the legislature, Shap Smith, who was the speaker for my entire time in the House, would say, people would ask him, why are 10 of the 11 members of the Appropriations Committee women? And he'd say, because women don't grandstand, they don't take hostages, and they don't hold things up on the budget. They make sure that they're putting sandwiches into the hands of children and protecting the environment and helping people afford the roof over their head. They just get the budget done. And so, I really feel like I stood on the shoulders of a lot of women who had shown that we bring a certain rigor and a certain sense of fairness to the process of making our state budget. So I served with, in a very privileged way on the House Ways and Means Committee, and then I became vice chair of the Natural Resources and Energy Committee. I did take time away from the legislature after that, after running for lieutenant governor, which was a great experience at the age of 29 to travel the state and talk to people about what kind of access to capital and business support they needed, what was keeping them from growing from a small business to a medium-sized business, which seems to be a major challenge for a lot of folks in terms of not having the technical assistance and the support to make that leap and know what kind of new regulations or new sort of employee bans they'd be hitting and what that meant for their business. And then, I went and got my master's degree at the Kennedy School of Government. My mentor at the Kennedy School was Obama's first chief economic advisor, Jason Furman, who I still keep in touch with. And I'll email him and say, can you help me figure out why 69% of unemployed people in Vermont right now are women? And he'll say, no, but that's a really good question. I'll look into it for you. So, it's great to have him still as a connection. And I just remember, a big thrust of his work and the kind of work he did for President Obama around the ACA and other economic policy decisions was to try and avoid picking winners and losers in the economy, but to really focus on how you resource and support your human capital, how you help people access housing, childcare, workforce development, skill building, and the kinds of supports they need to have agency in their lives, and not worry so much about, do we give money to global foundries or do we give money to, startups? So that was, a tremendous experience. Came back and I worked with the Vermont Community Foundation on opportunity zone ideas, and just sort of some of you, this became a big flash in the pan. Are these relevant? Do these help Vermont? Does this hurt Vermont? And some communities have successfully been able to access that kind of financing tool, but not to the great benefit, I would say, of a lot of distressed Vermonters or low-income communities necessarily. So, we were trying to see if there was more creative ways to bring that capital closer to the people who need it. And I think we're dealing with a similar question in terms of the state budget. We're about to double the amount of money that we usually see in our general fund in a year, with the federal money coming in, actually more than double. And, as we do that, one of the big principles that the Federal Reserve Bank or others would say is important to keep track of is that, there is only so much capital a distressed state, a rural state, and communities in our state can absorb without strategic planning and coordination, and especially to make sure that money gets to the people who need it most. So that's a big focus of mine in the legislature right now, and probably the reason that I chose to be on both commerce and economic development and government operations, which sounds like a real snooze fest, but government operations is where we decide how do we actually make government work for people, and sort of function in the way it's supposed to. And there are a lot of new things that we need to be doing, like language access, which I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about as well, and helping people feel safe and comfortable around our institutions, as well as evaluating how successful we are. And you can only do that if you disaggregate information by things like income, race, family status, gender, et cetera. So I'm also on the Government Accountability Committee, trying to change how we end up asking the right questions before we think we have the right answer. So that kind of brings us to today, if that's helpful, Joe, to sort of give people a sense of how my philosophy that I bring to government.
That was an awesome roadmap of your background and what leads you to where you are today. Thank you very much for that. That was great. Comments, questions from anybody for the senator? Okay, well, I'll ask one to start. So, knowing what you know about Vermont businesses and your constituents, and well, not just Chittenden County, but that's the ones you're probably most familiar with. Um, During the past, I don't know, 12 months or 11, 12 months of pandemic,
Mhm.
and its impact on businesses and sole proprietors and, all the myriad of businesses, but I'm thinking mostly small businesses. Um, do you, what do you sense has been the biggest challenge for the types of business proprietors that you cited as your family growing
Mhm.
up, basically?
Mhm. Yeah.
Has it been disproportionately more challenging for those folks, or has the pandemic, in some weird kind of way, kind of, I don't know, leveled the playing field in terms of, affecting broad swaths of businesses,
Mhm.
in the same negative kind of way?
Yeah. Is somebody from the Vermont Community Loan Fund here today? Don't be
I
afraid.
don't think so.
Okay, well, I was going to say this thing I'm about to say either way, because I did tell this to them publicly and privately. But I wanted to just tell a story about something that happened, last fall in the midst of the pandemic. that I think illustrates some of the challenges that BIPOC Vermonters faced, and BIPOC Americans in general. So, you know, we started to see what was obvious to some of us already in the beginning of the pandemic, which is without significant language access, without putting things in plain English, and without communicating a consistent and clear message, there were a lot of Black and immigrant businesses that were starting to get entirely left behind around the country in the pandemic. And so we saw that later in the numbers in terms of both women and BIPOC owned businesses. And I think if you dig deeper, there's probably an even, you know, there's more data to show you the deeper impact to Black Americans, just in terms of the crises that they faced personally and in their families, as well as for their businesses and access to capital and grants. But that was true in Vermont as well. You know, I will tell this to them as well, but I reached out to the state early in the pandemic as a candidate and just a concerned Vermonter and said, are you interpreting information in other languages at this point? And the first answer I got was, that's Burlington and Winooski's job, which is not the right answer, I will tell you that much. So, you know, I started beating the drum of, this is a crisis. This is a unfolding crisis where people are being left behind in real time. And we know we're going to be now in this for months. And, you know, we have the opportunity to do it right, and we're still missing that opportunity. And so I raised Vermont Community Loan Fund because toward the end of the legislative session, so this was probably early September at this point, after I had been saying for a couple months with Carn Cross, who folks may know, hey, Vermont traditionally has had, and credit unions have had traditionally a very poor record of lending to BIPOC businesses and to even women-owned businesses. And here are the numbers around that. It's about 2% or less for BIPOC-owned businesses, which is like one loan, you know, the last 8 years. And so, you know, we just want to highlight, we're not going to do any better in the pandemic just by hoping for the best, you know. So we did get the ear of several legislators who introduced what some folks may have now heard called the BIPOC business set aside. So there was $5 million set aside, 2.5 for women-owned businesses, 2.5 for BIPOC-owned businesses. The idea being, if any money was underutilized, it would go to the other group, which is a fine setup, but it took a long time. That money was much more time bound. So I'm grateful that we have the administration that we do that is stretching out the timelines for you know, using and utilizing this capital. But at the time, the money had to go out the door pretty quickly. They did not have the infrastructure set up to even know where BIPOC businesses were, to know what languages were needed, to be able to reach people quickly. They're not traditionally part of chambers and other networks that were getting weekly updates out to people. So there was a real lag in being able to get this information out. Why am I picking on Vermont Community Loan Fund? Because the week that grant package was put together and passed out of the legislature, I started to talk to people about, how are we going to get this information out? How are we going to make sure that people know we have $2.5 million of grant money for businesses who are eligible? And frankly, obviously, we were still trying to wade through, are you eligible? Are you not eligible? Did you have a business last year? Was it kind of fully formal? And that's something we're working through again this year. But the same week that grant program went live and became, you know, something that we could advertise and talk to people about how to access those grants, the Vermont Community Loan Fund felt on that Monday like they needed to get out a Black Lives Matter statement with like a Black background and white letters, some folks may remember this, and say, we have $1 million of loans available to the Black community. And I don't know if y'all know where I'm going with this, but that started to carry all around. Oh my gosh, loans are available to us. There's loans that we can access. And I started to say, what an irresponsible thing to do. We have just created access to grants that people don't have to pay back. And frankly, yes, do they probably need a loan as well, either if they're not eligible or they need extra financing? Sure. But the fact that on Monday, when you're also the people who are supposed to be doing the back end of the grants, you chose to only advertise your loans is really not okay. It really says a lot about how you wanted to talk about Black Lives Matter and you wanted a cookie, and not about what Black Vermonters needed in that moment. That out of $1.25 billion coming in to help Vermonters in crisis, here we had just $2.5 million in grants, and we get to the point where you're advertising $1 million in loans. So that's where, when white people, really want to do something good, they can be their own worst enemy, and they can really get in the way by wanting to sort of get the points rather than do the right thing for people of color. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but there was a lot in that moment of, I want to talk about how Black Lives Matter, which, if you're not ready to understand what that means and how you actually live out the value of what that means and actually support Black lives, then you're probably not doing a lot of good for people. And so that's what happened a lot in the pandemic. Not only did Black folks particularly get mixed messages, but something that looked like a good thing for them could turn out to be pretty predatory, or just not the full picture. And really, sort of make them worse off than they were going into the pandemic. So, that's sort of what I would say, is that without clear information and existing networks and infrastructure to support Black Vermonters, we saw a crisis emerge. And so folks may or may not know that, Black Vermonters were anywhere between 3 to 10 times as likely to be infected with COVID-19, made up a disproportionate number of frontline workers. We're in crisis, and the Department of Health, went out and said, hey, we believe this disproportionate rate is because of institutional racism. Well, institutional racism does exist in the medical system, but it also exists in every other system as well. So, when you had people who didn't feel safe asking for PPE because they thought they were going to get fired, or the ones who had to sort of go into work, or, the people who were just afraid to say anything at all because they worried about how people would treat them if they said they were sick, that was disproportionately Black people in Vermont. And it really ended up harming them in this crisis far more than it harmed other Vermonters.
Anybody else want to jump in?
I was going to let somebody else go first. Sorry.
Feel
Hello,
free,
Senator
man.
John Dwyer with New England Federal in Williston. I think I'd like to pick up on, if I could, where I think you were talking about towards the end, and specifically around affordable housing, and what you might believe is going to occur in the coming months as the legislature addresses the next round of funding. Yeah, there's been some press, and you may have a perspective on this as well, about the success of 2020 in investments in affordable housing. There's some hope, I believe, that there's going to be more investments coming from this round of federal funding. But on the street, or on the day-to-day activity, we face daily issues. We literally have hundreds of members who we have pre-approved for homes, and for, whether it's a condo or a house, and they're literally bidding against each other for the same small pool of accessible homes. So, we've been involved in different things and many of the people on the call have as well. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that whole. I know that's a big, broad topic, but is there some hope in this round of funding with additional success?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you raising that, because, having spent a long time in the legislative world and through the last economic crisis as well in 2009, the least sexy issues are kind of getting the most of the moment in the sun right now. We know that this has exacerbated housing and transportation and just sort of general economic resiliency issues, childcare being one, in a way that those are the topics of the legislature. Often we're otherwise sort of going after the shiny object and ignoring the really structural change that we have to make at that level. So that doesn't really answer your question, but I would say, even with the first, being on the housing committee, with the first round of funding that came through, the $200 million, that was pretty much only earmarked for rental assistance. There's very little flexibility in that. That was written in a different administration with a different set of goals. And we were asking, we probably spent too long asking, what about this? What about this? And the bill really just had to go through so people could get rental assistance, which is still critical. This round of funding has a lot more flexibility, a little bit less money. So we still have some of the other rental assistance money, Not a little bit, a lot. I think we have like at least $80 million of the other rental assistance money. That still is earmarked to go out. It has to go out quickly, and it has to go out just for emergency rental assistance. The new pot of money, I believe, I could be wrong, is about 100 million for rental assistance and 50 million for home ownership assistance. And the state is committing extra money to its VHIP program, so Vermont Housing Improvement. And in that program, they are trying to commit that at least 25% of the resources will go to creating homeownership opportunities for BIPOC Vermonters, which some folks might say, well, they don't make up 25% of our population, so why should they get 25% of the resources? I don't think it would be anybody here, but that's okay if you ask that question. And we also know that the Black homeownership rate in Vermont is 21%. I know this, now you will all know it too if you didn't. And the white homeownership rate is 71%. So that's one of the biggest housing disparities in the country in terms of access to homeownership. So I appreciate that the governor sees that as well. I think the other big question, like you're saying, somehow there's a small pool of housing in places that people really want to live, you know, and there frankly is less of a demand in places where they don't have broadband internet access, or it's more rural and isolated. And, you know, we have said to the governor and others in the Commerce and Community Development Agency, for BIPOC Vermonters, you can't just stick them in the middle of nowhere. You know, it doesn't matter how affordable you make a house, as I would say, if there's a Confederate flag across the street. So, you know, we also have a lot of work to do to make sure that every community in Vermont feels safe, accessible, and welcoming to people. That includes broadband, but it also includes a real reckoning with, you know, how safe does a person of color feel? How much has their police department, or, you know, have the state police in that area worked to make sure that they are racially and culturally sensitive, et cetera. So those are some of the big picture conversations that we're having as we look at a lot of money coming in for housing. And then I think we're all trying to figure out, are there more, how do we do this in a way that builds back better? You know, so how are we really deploying those resources to first-time home buyers, to people who, you know, really are going to make that commitment to Vermont? That's a challenge, right? You know, I think a lot of legislators would love to do you know, something to prioritize Vermonters who want to live and work here over second homeowners. You know, but we also want to acknowledge that second homeowners are becoming primary residents here as well. So, you know, we have also advanced my chair, Michael Sorokin's, you know, favorite program, which is the Vermont Worker Relocation Incentive and things like that, to help people with moving costs and home repairs, et cetera. But yeah, we probably right now have more one-time capital for housing than we have in the past, and we're trying to figure out how does the state use that for the types of housing that are least available and most in demand, transitional housing, et cetera. But if you all have ideas, this is the time, you know, to share those. I was on the phone earlier with folks at Working Fields, a new great program to help people in recovery get all the wraparound supports they need for employment, including transportation and housing. I would fund that in a heartbeat if I had one-time money. So, you know, I think I have an idea for how to embed AmeriCorps in their low-income communities and give them money as a rental assistance benefit that adds to their AmeriCorps dollars. So we're just trying to figure out, how do you get this money to people who otherwise wouldn't benefit from a lot of one-time money around housing.
Thank you. I will just say that, you know, as we've talked to legislative leaders through these conversations, we just want to, you know, recognize that, you know, the credit unions in the state are really the biggest mortgage lenders in the state. You know, last year, collectively, we were close to $2 billion in first mortgages here in Vermont. So as you're solving these challenges, we are a participant. You know, we also saw obviously significant deposit growth through the pandemic. And as we keep giving credit to other groups we work with, whether it's the HFA or others, you know, the state employees credit union, Rob can speak to this, is really well known in terms of the energy efficiency topic that you mentioned. We want to be there. We want to be part of the solution to help Vermonters and people moving to Vermont get into homes that they can afford.
Mhm.
So
You
the voice.
hold my mortgage, so thank you for that. And you know, I have at the same time talked to a lot of other people of color, particularly who want to buy their first house, and I have honestly found, you know, white angel investors, white, you know, people who want to be helpful to people of color in the state, especially those moving from places where they no longer feel safe in the state, to be co-signers, you know, to help them access loans. That's still the biggest challenge. You know, um, there are just a lot of people of color in the state who are undercapitalized, who don't have traditional 3-year look back source of income, and still have great credit and pay on time, but are not going to be great candidates for, you know, loan products, et cetera. And I wish I could say, you know, that I thought like you all were doing everything I thought you could, but you know, I don't know if opportunities is here. They might have heard me say this story before, but right when I, you know, got back from grad school, I needed $10,000 for the, you know, I had a loan through you all, and I needed $10,000 to turn I had owned a house that had been a dentist's office before. It was I rented it as a student. I owned it after the dentist left, and I had a physical therapist renting it. And then I came back from grad school and said, I'm going to turn this into housing. You know, the rental market has changed. People want 3 to 6 month housing for the hospital. Great business plan. I'll tell you that. I'm biased, but it was a great business plan. It took me 6 months to get $10,000 from Opportunities Credit Union. I came finally with a co-signer. And when I came with a co-signer who was a business owner in Chittenden County, he stood there with me and they said, we're going to give you this money in escrow. So you have to come get permission every time you want to use the money. And that was just every time I, you know, went to buy cleaning supplies or a piece of furniture, that's not something that was going to be, you know, feasible for me, let alone if I was somebody who didn't speak English that well, or didn't have, you know, had kids, had to juggle a lot of other time commitments. And finally, you know, my co-signer said, so I'm sorry, so is she going to start paying on the loan before she gets any of the money? You could be deciding if she has permission to use the money before, you know, while she has to pay on the loan. And they were like, you know what? We made a mistake, and they gave me the loan, and, you know, I was able to sort of go on my way. And I just say that story because it stuck with me. I mean, if it took me that much effort to get $10,000, most people would have given up by then just out of necessity. And then to get there and have them say, surprise, we're going to put it in escrow. I was like, you know what? I'm going to stay to talk to the president. I just got my master's degree. I have a co-signer with me, and this is what's happening to me. So what is happening to other people? And, you know, I know Northfield Savings Bank is partnering with Opportunities Credit Union. And I would just say, I think they both have things to offer to each other. You know, I think Opportunities Credit Union is present. It has the sort of visible presence in these communities. They look like they're going to help you, but they probably could learn something from Northfield Savings Bank about customer service and making sure that people feel like they're not surprised or sort of getting all of a sudden, you know, something confusing is happening to them. So I'm sure you all could tell me a million reasons why, you know, my situation was either unique or that's just sort of what happens in your world. But I almost never wanted to go back to a bank to get a loan after that, you know, and I can just tell you, if you're trying to attract new Americans and people who don't have traditional experiences with banking, it was embarrassing, and it was really jarring for me to go through that, you know. So I don't think even the credit unions, that shows in the numbers, don't have a great history of creating capital access, particularly for women of color in the state.
Yeah, I certainly would acknowledge that the very story you're telling is something that we all acknowledge. You know, there's no question that there are such stories about New England Federal, and what we're focused on is listening to those and other stories to really try to recognize that we have to change and we have to lower barriers. And I think the interest on our part is to, you know, as we all are, acknowledge that there have been situations where we have kept the bar too high. We may believe that bar was consistent, but nonetheless, it's too high. And we are working on that. But that doesn't matter until we demonstrate that. So I appreciate the story. I certainly recognize, and I can assure you, I'm sure there are such stories about us as well. But we're listening, and we're trying to affect change on those things.
So something this is off subject, but something that you referenced that just caught my ear because I hadn't heard it referenced for quite a while. And granted, I haven't been out looking for references to it and whatnot. But when you referenced about Senator Sorokin's interest in the Vermont worker relocation program, whatever the right terminology is for it and whatnot.
Forget what we went with ultimately too, but yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've kind of lost track of that mentally. It's been some time since I've heard anybody reference it or read anything
Mhm.
about it or whatnot. Have you any idea from your committee or by other means what the, I guess I'll call it, success of that effort has been, and is it still out there, or is that a thing of the past now?
I mean, I would, I don't know if there's a lot of arguments about philosophically what success looks like. Were we trying to attract people who otherwise couldn't pay for moving costs, or sweeten the pot for people who now are major taxpayers in the state? And this was just the little push they needed. We got tons of free publicity. I don't think anyone disagrees, that it certainly put Vermont, I heard a lot of people getting Vermont and Maine confused when it sort of hit, but it put Northern New England on the map as like, wow, they're really welcoming people there. And then of course the pandemic hit, and in fact, people who were eligible for the program and had applied have not all gotten their, $5,000 to $10,000 that they were going to get. And that's sort of the different maximums that we're dealing with, but they still have to demonstrate that it was for moving costs, upgrading infrastructure like broadband that they needed at home, and anything that sort of helped them. And that was a remote worker program. And I think the new interest we'll see as this gets debated, it has not come through the Senate yet, and I believe it will make it out of committee, but I can't be sure. It has before in the Senate. Is that, there's also this desire from the governor's administration that I would agree with, that we use the money to help attract nurses and workers in fields where we really need people, and we also really try to have an additional push to get veterans and BIPOC folks to move to the state as well. So just acknowledging that we have a desire to make our state more diverse, make our workforce more diverse, and honor some particular affinity groups and think about the positions that are really needed. So medical professionals are going to be really prioritized in this round of funding. So I think we did see success. We saw people move here who are still here, but I also, whether it's that program or stay to stay or other programs in the state, we don't have a good handle after 1 year what happens to that person. So again, I'd really like us to have better evaluation tools and longer term tracking. That does take more investment into ACCD and other, state agencies, but we don't know what happens to people except anecdotally after about a year, I would say. So, that's something that I've always wanted to make sure we're keeping a better handle on. And as we talk about kind of equity issues as well, stay to stay, for example, people have reached out to me and said, I'm a Black Vermonter who came here through stay to stay. I'm thinking of leaving now. It's been a couple of years and I'm not having a good experience here. People would say, I'm from Mississippi and the racism feels worse here than it does there. So that's a lot to hear. It's hard to hear, but if we don't know that information, we don't know how to make it better for folks. So, with a lot of these programs that seem very creative and interesting, I don't know what the success rate is over a longer period of time. And I think it got us a lot of recognition in one way, come be a remote worker. Maybe we'll see with this funding that's specifically targeted to certain populations, including medical professionals, another kind of version of success at bringing people here in the short term, but I can't tell you the success of the long-term program.
Thank you. Hey, other questions for the senator or commentary?
I have to think that you feel pretty isolated up here if you're from the BIPOC community. And are there ways to support people when they live in some of the further off communities, say, than Burlington, that would help them feel more welcome and less isolated?
That's a great question. I mean, I'll tell you some of what I've heard. You know, I live in Shelburne now, where I'm pretty sure I'm one of like 3 adult people of color in town. And I'm always like, have me come speak at the schools, because a lot of people have adopted across race. And I'm like, they need to see a person of color in their lives. So I'm happy to come speak in the schools. And, you know, so I being in Shelburne is very different, because I'm, you know, minutes away from certain ethnic restaurants and other things that make me feel a little bit more comfortable. You know, certainly what I've heard is that similarly to over the course of history in Vermont, there has been, you know, there have been people who feel like they've been driven out of the more rural places in the state. You know, people may know historically, there was a night of terror when, you know, 40 plus Black people were driven out of Woodstock with like people with, you know, torches, et cetera. I learned that like working with the land trust, and I was like, can you send me an article about that? So, you know, there have been moments in history. I mean, Alexander Twilight, people tried to push his schoolhouse off its foundation. You know, there's Buffalo Soldiers doubled the Black population of Vermont at the turn of the last century. And, you know, really in a combination of sort of classic racism and eugenics, started to see the writing on the wall. We're not welcome here. Eugenics, of course, we were part of the intellectual center of the eugenics movement that tried to erase a lot of indigenous people and other people from our communities. So we have a lot of unreckoned with past in Vermont that we need to account for. And, you know, I don't think that's different than a lot of other states, but a lot of other states are forced to acknowledge that a lot more than we are. And they have had reckonings about, you know, should we have these monuments to Confederate soldiers, et cetera? Well, we have a lot of monuments to eugenicists in Vermont, and we barely want to have that conversation about the harm that that does to people who had been targeted in the recent past from the Abenaki community. So we have, it's kind of like you need the truth before the reconciliation. And so then I personally see a lot of those patterns repeated. I have helped several Black women move from more rural parts of the state, not always because they started to feel unsafe, but because people started attacking their children. And so, you know, calling them names, you know, coming close to their house, people's kids started to get scared, and no one deserves to go through that. No one can put up with that. No one can sacrifice their children for their cause. So folks may have heard Tina Cook, for example, who ran for the Bennington Select Board and came close to winning, sent her son out of state when she ran. And so, you know, that kind of leads me to, you know, a kind of great success story I can share, which is a lot of people of color have been seeing this and saying, you know, we need to know about people before they're in crisis in our rural areas, before, like Rachel Edens, for example, came onto our radar when she was appointed to the select board, and then 2 weeks later started getting harassed in this very racially threatening way. And so we almost lost her as like the 3rd Black woman on a select board in the state, and we're grateful she decided to stay. So between her, Esther Thomas, who just got elected in Middlebury, and Zariah Hightower, we only have 3 Black women serving in municipal local government elected bodies. We have a few more members of school boards, but we started to say, hey, we need to know where everybody is before there's a crisis. We need to reach out to them and have a support network, and make sure they feel supported locally and by a statewide network. And that's around the same time that Northfield Savings Bank Foundation started to say, hey, you know, we give money away every year, and this year we should really commit to racial justice and equity. And sometimes organizations have that great intention, but still put a lot of the money toward like, well, let's all spend a year going through our own equity training, which is important. But if you're, you know, if you're used to giving money away, give the money away, right? Give it to organizations that do that work, that are led by people of color. And Yael Friedman, who's the chair of their foundation board, said, I'm just going to call the people of color I know and figure out which organizations are led by people of color that do really trusted, meaningful work. So I was one of those people that she called, and it was probably the most fruitful 20-minute conversation I ever had, because I named a few organizations, and some of them were given, you know, $100,000 grant, including introducing her to Tabitha Moore, who started the Rutland area NAACP. And Tabitha said, you know, we have some of our own programming. Probably the thing we're most excited about is trying to help people of color gain leadership skills and a network of support to run for office and to serve in major leadership roles like leading a nonprofit, being in the public eye, et cetera. So Yael said, great, here's $100,000. And, you know, it took 6 months for us. And I, you know, I'm a more sort of like go-getter type of person, but at the same time, I have a lot of privilege, and I wasn't in the pandemic trying to help my kids and help, you know, my whole community necessarily. I had a lot of responsibility, but, you know, there's a lot of people who just did not have any capacity to start an organization. So we sat on the money for 6 months, and I kept thinking, oh my God, they're going to be like mad at us. You know, we're not doing anything. We haven't done anything with the money. And so finally we got it together, as folks may have seen in the press, you know, in early February, to start the organization, to announce it, we have our first class that we're going to recruit in April. We hope to start the program on May 1st and have, you know, a class of people of color that are going through our signature leadership training. And I think what makes it different in a very instant way than other leadership programs is people will be paid to go through it, not have to pay to do it, because that's just that's a no-go for a lot of people to pay for a leadership training program. And they'll be taken care of, and they'll be in community with other folks. And we called it the Bright Leadership Institute, as some folks may have heard, because Luvenia Dorsey Bright was the first Black woman to serve in the legislature from South Burlington in the 90s. And Northfield Savings Bank could have never known that giving us $100,000, no strings attached, do what you said you were going to do, we're just happy to give you the money, meant that I could call Bill Bright and say, you know, we're honoring your mother who served 3 decades ago, who didn't get the recognition that she deserved, and we're naming this program after her. And so, you know, when people who are traditionally used to holding on to power let go of it and let other people make decisions who traditionally have not been given that opportunity, really good things happen. You know, and you probably, some of you may have seen or heard national information that says, you know, about 6% or something of capital and access to grants and nonprofit support goes to Black women. And yet so many more programs are aimed at turning, you know, population health numbers or success indicators around for Black communities. Just give the money to Black women. You know, I think that was really the message of 2020, is give money to the people who know what to do, and good things will happen, you know, and you get to celebrate it. Like, I'm celebrating Northfield Savings Bank Foundation everywhere I go, because they let go of control, because they didn't need to sort of control the outcome to feel successful. I think that's the model for the moment. And, you know, I'm really grateful that they saw that. And I keep saying to them, you know, oh, we're still going to report back to you. And is this okay? And is that okay? And they're like, are we making you feel like stressed out? Do you feel like you need to tell us this stuff? And I'm like, I think I do, because I'm just so, I'm not used to an organization being so willing to let go of that control and really let, you know, Black Vermonters lead and do their thing. And I think it's been incredible. And I think it's attracting other donations and capital so that this program can keep going. So that's my success story from the financial institutions, you know, is just let go, you know, and beautiful things will happen, things that you could never imagine.
It's a great example. Thank you.
Anything else from anybody on this fine sunny afternoon?
Oh, I could always give my voice a break. It's, you know, but happy to take another question if there is one.
I don't know that there is. So you might get, what, about 8 minutes back of this hour. Hey, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Senator Rahm. It's been insightful hearing, well, your insights and perspectives. And thank you very much for sharing them with us. We have these meetings weekly, pretty much weekly. There was a lull for a period of time, but pretty much weekly, with a variety of different people and everything, and some of your peer legislators and whatnot. And we really appreciate hearing all the different perspectives on a myriad of different issues, but particularly this one. We've had a few people talking to us about DEI related kind of discussions and whatnot, and this has been insightful and enlightening. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And I'll just end by saying something similar to what I said to Chris Delia, which is, you know, it's really valuable when people don't feel like they're competing, but that you all are working together to better serve Vermonters who have otherwise been left behind. You know, that I think will be really helpful in building new models. So to see some of the exciting ideas coming up between new partnerships. It's not about sort of being the first one in a community to sort of get all the new business and the new deposits. I'm sure that is for you to some extent, but you'll get more the more you collaborate. So kind of going from a scarcity model to a sense of abundance, I think will help everybody, because there are so many people who deserve access to financial security and access to, a lending institution, who just feel really stressed out, and feel really left behind. And so working as a financial community to reach those folks, I think we'll have a lot more success.
Thank you for that advice. And thank you for wrapping up your string of speaking engagements today with us, or at least I hope this is wrapping it up and you're not continuing on until sunset.
I'm doing some listening later in the day, but I think I'll just go get some vitamin D in the meantime.
Well, good for you. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody else for joining us this afternoon too. We have next week, and I'm still waiting for a confirmation from his office, but Senator Leahy will be with us next week. So we look forward to that and hope you'll all join us then as well. Thank you again, Senator, and thank you everyone else for being on the line with us. Have a great week.